the Middle East, I mean, they have also been reporting that there are lots of shipments coming from from Europe to Israel,
Yeah,
which make a lot of people speculating that Israel is now preparing, stockpiling, and preparing
yeah,
the next round. So the
yes,
ceasefire is
it
very
is.
fragile, right?
It is. I mean, that's exactly what it is. I mean, that's exactly what's happened. What we have is a very, very unstable ceasefire.
Mhm.
I mean, Iran still apparently has its enrichment capability.
Mhm.
At least it has the scientists. It's got the ability to make centrifuges. It perhaps has its uranium stockpile. The IAEA is the door has been shut on it by Iran. So none of the underlying issues have been resolved. The Iranians are refusing to negotiate with the Americans unless they receive guarantees that Israel and the United States are not going to attack Iran again. The Americans probably don't want to give those guarantees. And how reliable would such guarantees be anyway? Nobody knows whether the Iranians will stick to their position that they're not going to acquire nuclear weapons, or whether they could, in fact, press forward with a nuclear weapons program. So, given the uncertainties, there is a very, very high risk, I would say even a probability, that unless something is sorted out and agreed within the next few weeks or months to break this deadlock, that we will have another Israeli attack, an American attack on Iran again. So, we are in a very unstable and unsatisfactory pause at the moment.
You see, um, I find, Trump, before he became the president, he said he want this peace deal, he want that, ceasefire, he said all these things. There is a very easy way for Trump to do it. If he stopped supporting, countries like Ukraine with
Yeah.
weapons, stop supporting Israel with weapons, and then the fight will all stop. But he can't do that, right?
What do I tell you? What do I tell you, Sophia? That you're too Chinese, that you approach these things in too rational way. You are absolutely right. And if we talk about Iran in particular, the deal, as I've said many times, was there on the table. The
Yeah.
Americans said they don't want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
Iran said it didn't want to acquire nuclear weapons. Both sides agreed on the eventual objective. The only problem, therefore, was to come up with mechanisms to achieve it. And those mechanisms would not have been difficult to achieve. You already had the IAEA in Iran. You could have built on that and you could have arrived at a strong, satisfactory deal, which it must be said would probably have been very similar to the deal you had in 2015, which Trump himself tore up. So, I mean, this is an entirely solvable problem. And we now have a situation, a far worse situation, which is the one I just described, where nobody quite knows. Probably Iran itself doesn't know what it is going to do going forward. So, this is a very, very bad situation. And the attack on Iran, far from resolving anything, has made it much, much worse. Now, I'm going to say something. I think the Iranians do need to start listening to the advice of their friends. Russia has been giving them good advice. China has been giving them good advice. The Chinese and the Russians have told them they're prepared to help. Interestingly enough, I don't know whether you know, but the Iranian defense minister apparently has expressed an interest in the JC-10,
Mhm.
the,
Mhm.
the, the aircraft that the
Yeah.
Pakistanis had. By all means, so buy your weapons from China, buy your weapons from Russia, do all of those things, but listen to their advice about your nuclear program. Going nuclear is not in Iran's own best interests, but work with the Chinese and the Russians. They can help you probably to arrive at a good deal. But of course, what the Iranians are going to do is another matter. It's a very, very bad situation. And we should never have been put in this place in the first place. And the reason we are in this terrible situation, first of all, the blame for that rests with Israel, obviously, but also with Donald Trump in the United States.
Well, Iran just did make a one strategic shift that they ditched the GPS and now going
Yeah,
for using the Chinese Baidu
yeah.
for their navigation. The only surprise here is it took Iran this long to do that. You would think that should be the first thing they do, right? They should have done this a month ago. One explanation, lots of discussions in the Chinese media is that within Iran, there is still very strong pro-US kind of factions. So they're not fully unified within Iran. Could that be the problem?
The people in China who are saying that are absolutely right. It has been the besetting problem. Iran has always been very reluctant to actually commit fully to strong relations with China and Russia. Now, with Russia, there's reasons for this because Russia and Iran have had a very complicated history with each other. They fought 5 wars, a fact which isn't widely known. The Russians won most of them, by the way. They lost Azerbaijan as a result of those wars. The Soviets invaded Iran alongside the British in the 1940s. They had good reason to. This is during the Second World War, when it looked like Iran might ally with Germany. The Soviets occupied Tehran at the time of the famous Tehran Conference, when Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met, just to say. Anyway, there's been a long history of difficult relations between Russia and Iran. So the Iranians have some reason to be suspicious of the Russians. They have no reason at all to be suspicious of China. They have never had difficult relations with China. But there is a very, very big section of Iranian society that hankers for good relations with the West and sees the entire objective of Iranian foreign policy to get back to normalize relations with the West and to persuade the United States to lift sanctions on Iran. And that has led them, I think, into all kinds of errors. One was to stick with GPS. I mean, they shouldn't have given up on that a few days ago or a few months ago. They should have given up on that years ago. I mean, when the options to actually go for the Chinese system already existed. So that's the first thing. That's one example. But I think this whole business of enriching uranium up to 60% levels in order to try to use that as a bargaining chip with the Americans was always flawed. Because what was the purpose of that bargaining chip? Ultimately, to get the Americans to lift sanctions on Iran. The Americans haven't lifted sanctions on Iran. They've attacked Iran instead. Now, far better for Iran to have worked to develop its relations with the BRICS, to fully commit to the BRICS, to develop strong relations with China, to develop strong relations with Russia too, which is its neighbor, to put aside the bad history that existed there. And I think that the previous Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, understood that. But I think the current one, Pezeshkian, doesn't. I think he still believes that Iran has a future having a good relationship with the United States and with the West. So the result is that Iran has this overcomplicated diplomacy, which leads it into traps which it needs to escape from. And I think the people in China who've made that assessment, once again, are being very insightful and have understood the situation very well.
Isn't that a problem that the Soviet had, right? That Gorbachev and Yeltsin, they all had this idea, even to a certain degree. In the beginning, I think Putin also, they thought they could work closely with the West. Somehow they all believe that, right?
I had so many conversations with Russians about this.
Yeah.
And they have come to realize, not all Russians, I mean, there's still minority who think otherwise. But they've come to realize that this has been their constant disaster.
Yeah.
Why did the Soviet Union and China quarrel in the 1950s and 1960s?
Yeah.
It was because Khrushchev sacrificed the alliance with China in order to achieve better relations with the West. What did that result in? The collapse of the Soviet Union eventually. And I mean, I have to say, in complete fairness, there are many, many people in Russia now who understand that, including within the political leadership and the political class. And I mean, the one thing that you will always hear them say now is that the quarrel with China was the Soviet Union's biggest mistake. I mean, that was the ultimate cause of everything that went wrong. But you're quite right. Putin still wanted to improve relations with the West. He now understands that that is impossible. The Russians intellectually and mentally have got past that, I think. But in Iran, they haven't. I just want to pass on something which goes exactly back to what the, those people on the netizens have been saying about Iran. I actually had a discussion about Iran with somebody that I met in St. Petersburg when I was addressing that legal forum. And he was a civilian, I should say. He was not somebody who was from the military. He was Russian. And he said to me that the Russians have had various dealings with Iran over the last 3 or 4 years. And they have found that Iran is a very difficult country to help. That there's always this issue that somehow doing a deal with you, or indeed with China, or joining the BRICS is second best. The best would be improving relations with the US. And of course, firstly, that isn't true anyway. I mean, there's no way in which relations with China and Russia are second best. But secondly, I mean, what they imagine in the best is the best isn't even on offer.
Yeah, it's not even an option. Yeah, well, that's where the problem, I think, countries like Russia, China, I mean, to a certain degree, there are also forces within China want to, get good relationship with the West. Well, the problem, I think, at least China realized, now is that China is simply too big. And the same thing with Russia. Russia is simply too big, too powerful as a country for the United States to accept, right, to have an equal term, because the US will always feel very uncomfortable to have a powerful Russia or powerful China, right? Always be. That's always the problem. But
I absolutely agree. I mean, I'm going to say there is a difference between China's relations with the West and Russia's relations with the West. And this I noticed already, by the way, way back in the 70s when, Nixon came to Beijing and met Mao and Zhou Enlai and all of that, which is the Chinese always have in their relations with the West a tremendous self-confidence, which the Russians don't, or at least didn't until very recently. Stalin apparently had it. I mean, he wasn't impressed or afraid of the West at all. But the leaders who came after him did. Khrushchev and Brezhnev and all of them. They were in awe of the West. The Chinese never have been. And I think this is much, much more widespread within Chinese society, because China is this tremendous country with this tremendous history and this enormous cultural self-confidence. And I think that after the Communist Party of China achieved that event, I think it's called liberation in China, if I'm not mistaken.
The liberation.
After they achieved it, I mean, there's been no turning back. I mean, they feel again that restored their sense of belief in themselves, and they've never really been in awe of the West in the same way, because why should they be? Whereas the Russians, much younger country altogether, much less self-confident. They've always been, until very recently, in awe of the Americans, and the Iranians still are.
Well, maybe then we can say that probably the biggest achievement for the Communist Party of China is to bring back confidence
Oh
for
yes,
for the
yes.
for the Chinese people. Yeah, that's a
Absolutely.
huge,
I don't think
huge.
there's any question about this. I absolutely believe that, and that's partly because the leadership of the Communist Party of China, Mao, first and foremost,
Mhm.
never lacked that self-confidence, that self-belief in themselves. You look at Khrushchev, and you see his interreactions with the American leaders, and you can see his sense of inferiority. And
Mhm.
there's an extraordinary scene where he's arguing with Nixon about who has the better kitchens, Americans or Russians. Ludicrous things. Um, can you imagine someone like Mao or Zhou Enlai
Mhm.
ever getting into an argument with Nixon about something like that?
No, then if I mean, there's a lot of developing country are trying to copy China. Maybe they
Yeah,
can start with self-confidence,
yeah,
including
absolutely.
Iran,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
So,
absolutely. Well, indeed, absolutely,
yeah.
including Iran. I mean, Iran has had a difficult history too. I mean, it was essentially a protectorate of Russia and Britain during the 19th century. The Russians and the British were dividing Iran into spheres of influence and things of that
Mm.
kind. And then, as I said, it had a very difficult history afterwards. And then, after the Second World War, the Americans basically ran everything there. So they have all of these problems to work through. But as you correctly said, they should look at China and look at the self confidence that the Chinese nation has achieved.
Okay. All right. Always interesting talking to you. So let's talk next
Thank you.
week again.
Absolutely looking forward to it. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.